Hi, and welcome to Founded on Purpose, the show where we get to know the people working at the intersection of business and impact, profit, and purpose. I'm your host, Katie McBratney. Each episode, we welcome a founder, investor, or other change maker to the show to answer the same set of questions. And while those questions may be the same, the perspectives and the insights and conversation they open up are always wildly different. Our guest today fell in love with vintage fashion at the ripe old age of 4 years old when she received her first piece of vintage. Since then, she's turned this passion into a profession, using her years of experience as a vintage seller, customer, and collector to launch Fashion Conservatory, the destination for all things vintage fashion. Authenticity, community, and knocking down the gatekeepers are her jam. So please welcome Fashion Conservatory co-founder and CEO, Melinda Villareal, to the show.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
I'm so glad to dive in. And like you know, we have the same set of 8 questions, and I'm ready. Are you?
I'm so ready. Let's do this.
So let's start here. Always at the beginning is a great place.
It is.
In one word, Melinda, what's your purpose?
What's my purpose in one word? Helping.
Say more.
I like to help people. I like to help animals. I like to help objects. Just helping in general.
Tell me more about helping objects, because helping people, helping animals, I'm sure we have lots of people nodding and they're like, yes, me too. How do you help an object? What does that look like?
So an interesting thing in my industry, a lot of people that quote unquote rescue vintage also rescue animals and other things. So helping an object, when you find something out in the world that with just a little bit of help can make it 10 more years, 20 more years and be serviceable, I think if you can do that, you should. So when it comes to vintage, you might find something that needs a new hem or needs cleaned or maybe needs a slight alteration to still be serviceable for the next several years. And we'll go ahead and fix it and send it back out to a new owner and a new life.
That's so interesting. And also because I know you and I know your business, I've learned that there's a lot to learn about vintage fashion and not just designers and styles, but also the actual artifacts, like the garments themselves, how they're constructed, the different materials used, the different techniques, the craft of it all, plus also like the preservation, like how you store them, all of that. How do you weave that helping these objects, these garments, not just to make them wearable, but it sounds like there's also a reverence for them in how you talk about it. So tell us a bit about like what that help in terms of preservation or celebration looks like.
Yeah, so when you see something in a museum, it's being helped, quote unquote, right? When you see something out in the world, maybe at an estate sale, a thrift store, in the trash, wherever you might find the thing, which can pretty much be anywhere, helping to preserve that piece, in my opinion, is helping to preserve a little piece of human history. So fashion is very intertwined with human history. We've been wearing clothes for tens of thousands of years. And I think it's not as revered as some of the other things that are considered human history. It's just like, oh, we wear clothes, like this t-shirt I'm wearing, whatever, I'll give it away when I dance. And a lot of people don't think like, well, 50 years from now, someone's going to want this t-shirt. And that's what happens. I mean, right now, I know a lot of people are collecting like rock t-shirts, vintage rock t-shirts. And the person that bought that vintage rock t-shirt at the concert wasn't thinking when they bought it, like, oh, someone else is going to wear this when I'm done. 50 years from now, some kid's going to pay a fortune for it online. I think it's the coolest thing ever, even though I've been using it for the last 5 years to polish my car. And I think if people start thinking that way, like, oh, this thing I have is going to get passed on. And that's pretty important. It happens with furniture. It happens with things like quilts and heirlooms. But a lot of people don't think of it in the context of fashion or the clothes you wear every day. So people don't consider the clothes they wear every day as quote unquote fashion. It really is, how you choose to present yourself, how you choose to be comfortable in this world, the clothes you might wear that make working your job easier. All of those things are in some way, that apparel and fashion world. And it's, your history right now. Like the shirt you're wearing right now, it's getting recorded, it's getting put online. Someday someone else might have that shirt and find your recording and be like, oh my God, I found the shirt I was wearing. How cool is this? And that's what I do nowadays with dresses. And I find an advertisement or a picture of the original owner wearing the garment. It's exciting. It's cool. So right now, they're wearing a piece of history.
My banana shirt, it's both part of history, it's personal, but it's universal, right? I mean, clothing is something we all share, whether or not we share the same style, the same reference, or have the same regard for it, which is beautiful. And there's definitely a sustainability arc that we can dive into, and it might come up later because
for sure, yeah,
fast fashion is a thing, and we can get into that rabbit hole later. It might come up, but I want to name that, right? This idea of labeling what is fashion, what is clothing, what is function, what is style, what is expression is all kind of bundled up with the history and the celebration of vintage fashion, which you live at the center of.
Every day. I love it.
Well, speaking of that, and since you're in a place that you love, right? What's your most recent win?
Well, we just got some really incredible consignment in from a museum, and unpacking those boxes was pretty spectacular. I would say that's a pretty big one for me, getting to see all these beautiful museum pieces.
What was the coolest? What was your favorite? The one that you thought about keeping for yourself?
Honestly, Katie, there are so many. There's so many really incredible pieces in there. There's a Courage jumper, like a little strapless dress, very mod, like someone you see pictured in the magazine, but it looks kind of like a gingerbread man because it's cream and it's brown and it's really structured. It's very cool. There was an haute couture Givenchy in there from the 60s. It's just blowing my mind. There was also a really incredible black snakeskin trench coat with fur trim and huge metal buckles that we've all been we have it on the end of the rack so we can just walk by it every day and look at it because it's really beautiful. And there are so many incredible things in our warehouse, and it's just a privilege to kind of be a part of their life cycle as they move on to new places. I don't know if I could label one win necessarily. You know what I mean? They're just
you've got to feel like a kid at Christmas or something, or like it's always your birthday, opening up these boxes. Though you sell things online, but these are physical products, and a lot of them come through your warehouse, right? So you get these boxes, and sometimes it's a mystery, and you get these gems. I'm sure sometimes it's not as exciting of an end, but and how does that feel to just know that that's part of the work?
It's wild because sometimes you'll open a box and it'll just be like one amazing thing after another, and it's just too much to handle. And sometimes you'll open a box and it'll be like old rags, but you know that there's like a reason those rags were packed up. So you start digging through old rags and you just think oh, maybe there isn't anything in here. And then you'll find like a beautiful slipper satin 1940s wedding dress. And it's just, you never know. So it is absolutely always Christmas. And even when you're digging through the things that at first might not seem important, you find out that they are important to someone. So even though it might not be cool to you, someone else out there is going to think it's really cool. And that is an exploration that I really love to take. For example, one of my absolute favorite pieces in the whole wide world, it's people see what I sell online, and I think my favorite thing is going to be I'll sell super fancy designer bitchy thing, and it's a 1950s men's work jacket in baby blue gabardine, which if you know what gabardine is, you know what I'm talking about. And it is worn to heck and back, totally beat up, but it's so broken in that it feels like it's been mine forever. Even though I've only had it about 10 years, I feel like this coat was mine in another life. Like this thing has lived a life, it has been worked to death, and now I'm a part of its next life cycle. And it's made in a way where even though it's really, really thrashed right now, it's going to be here for another, 30, 40 years easily. And if I take care of it, because I'm probably not going to let it go for the next 30 years, let's face it. If I take care of it, it'll be here long after I'm gone. So sometimes unpacking the things that most people aren't going to be that excited about is more interesting than the stuff that's obviously cool, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And it makes me think of these sliding doors moments and that adage that one person's trash is another person's treasure, right? And
absolutely,
it comes with discernment and education and, of course, aesthetic and time and all of that. But it seems like, from an outsider's perspective, as someone who's not educated in vintage, it seems like there is a lot of garments, right? There's garments out there, but there's a lot of combination of luck and timing and skill and opportunity in finding something, be it for yourself as like a customer, a museum as a curator or a collector, but also for you as really like an e-tailer. There's a combination of different factors. And, if somebody decides not to clean out their garage one weekend, it never ends up with you. Or if somebody decides that they'd rather buy something from a big box store or fast fashion, they miss out on a big opportunity, which leads me to a bigger question. What would you say is the biggest missed opportunity in the field? Right? Like, you're sitting at this intersection as someone who's experienced different sides of it and is now building a platform to solve a lot of problems and meet a lot of needs. But what is that biggest missed opportunity that folks just haven't grabbed yet?
Yeah. So are you talking from a business perspective or a personal perspective? So I can go into either or.
Dealer's choice. It could be yes and.
Okay. So from a business perspective, I don't think anyone has taken the vintage fashion industry seriously, which is a huge mistake. It's absolutely massive. People love it. It's sustainable. And what typically happens is a platform starts. They realize there's a lot of money to be made with the vintage community. So they bring them all on board and talk them up like, oh, we're going to treat you so great. We're building community. This is fantastic. And then as soon as they build up their platform to be serviceable to a bigger like Walmart or Amazon style market, they step on the vintage people, throw them out the door, and start going with, instead of one of a kind, with things that are mass produced. And I think that's really horrible. From a personal perspective, missed opportunity it's a lack of education. So a lot of things that get thrown out or trashed because the people that own them and have the control to sell or trash them don't understand that they have value. And I think that's a really big missed opportunity. And a lot of people that are in the vintage world, sellers, buyers, professionals, whatever it might be, they have a tendency to want to keep their secrets. They want to be the only one that has the information about the certain rivets on the jeans that make them special, or the labels that are going to bring more money. And they don't want to tell anyone else that because they want to be kind of like that, the main source for that information. And by not sharing that information, by not educating other people as to what's important and what's not, a lot of people do see these old clothes as something to be disposed of. So a lot gets lost. We refer to it as like, it's lost to time. Like, don't know where it went. It got trashed. It got used up. It got destroyed. Whatever happened to it, it's been lost to time. So I think that's a big problem in the industry nowadays, which is, it's becoming more obvious as more people are selling online and TikToks about it and social media and all that kind of stuff. But there's still a large portion of the population that is very new clothing focused, that will come across a bunch of old stuff and just get rid of it, sometimes straight into the trash can. And it can be highly desirable, but it can also be like, even if it's not highly desirable, it's something that can be used instead of going into the trash, So I think those are two pretty big missed opportunities in my industry.
It's always interesting to hear about it from an insider's point of view, right? Because I'm sure everyone listening has an opinion about fashion and is like, oh, I could never do this. Or, yeah, I like to donate, or I use everything until it's in threads. But you have decades of experience from different angles and really being able to tilt that prism of perspective to say, like, here's this need, this opportunity that is missed from multiple different angles is really always such an insightful question. And building on something you feel very confident in, we're going to move on to the next question, which is, when was the last time you were wrong, Mel?
The last time I was wrong?
Yep.
Oh, like every day. It's like he's not that. So there's a running joke in the office that whenever I specifically make a plan and get organized, we know that's the one thing that will never happen. And sure enough, last week, I made the mistake of getting really organized and having a plan for the next 2 weeks. And one of my main employees, her car broke down and she wasn't here for 3 days. So we had to postpone everything. So it's just like, sometimes I feel like pre-planning things. Nope, I should know better by now. It's always, something's going to hit the fan and it's always going to get rescheduled. And if you're talking about like wrong, a different kind of wrong, all the time, and with vintage, like, there's no definitive answer with a lot of vintage. So sometimes you'll be looking at something and you'll think, oh, that looks 70s. That's got to be 70s. And you'll open it up and start looking at the labels and start looking at the seams and start looking at how it's put together. And you'll realize, oh, wait, no, that's just a primitive sewing technique and it's actually 90s. So that kind of stuff happens all the time. Like, always looking deeper.
What are the implications of being wrong or getting that right when you're dating or identifying like a garment? Like, what happens if you hit the nail on the head exactly, and what's the implication if like you're like, oh, oops, I thought that was 1940s?
So for me, if I'm not sure, because I'm listing things online, like in my personal life it's different, but because I'm listing things online as someone who is a quote unquote, vintage fashion expert, because I have so many years of experience, etc.
Take away those air quotes. You've earned it. We're throwing those air quotes away.
But I think that, like, when it comes to something like vintage fashion, there's no way to be an expert because it's constant learning. There's too much. So I can be an expert at one aspect of vintage fashion and not the other. Does that make sense? It's kind of like someone saying they're an expert in Photoshop. Photoshop's too big to be an expert in every little thing. They may have like certain sets of things down great, but an expert in the whole thing, like, I kind of shake my head at that, right? So for me, vintage is kind of the same way. There's just too much to claim to be an expert in all of it. So back to clothing and listing it and trying to tell a customer as much as I can about the thing. If I'm not sure, I will just flat out say, I'm not sure. And I will give reasons as to why. The other day I was working with a dress that it was an Edwardian dress that had been shortened for the 1920s. And at first glance, you think like, oh, that's a dress like on the cusp. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, well, it's on the cusp of this era or that era. But in reality, when you start looking deeper, when you start looking under the surface, it's actually truly an Edwardian dress that was just altered to be shorter for the 20s. So those kinds of things you're running into all the time. In the 30s, for example, they had these beautiful long dresses that came back again in the 70s. And you'll see a lot of dresses that look a little 70s. They're actually late 30s, early 40s. And you'll also see a lot of 1930s dresses that have been altered to fit the 70s aesthetic. So, they had the trains cut off and they were worn more as day dresses, evening dresses, those types of things. So there's so much going on all the time. Yeah.
It sounds like being able to pinpoint and when you're accurate on that, it sounds like you're able to find the home for that garment, or at least like put it out there as like, the more accurate you can be, the more it can find its new rightful owner. And if folks are out there listing things that they know nothing about, not only are they not rehoming these garments and preserving history and craft and all of that, they're also leaving money on the table.
They can, but I think too, at least a lot of the vintage sellers that I know, They're more concerned with, making a profit on what they made, which is great, and getting it into new hands in a safe and sound way. So even if then there have been plenty of pieces where I've been like, I really don't know. Like, I think it's one thing, but this indicates another, and I'm not sure. And it could be just a really good reproduction. And it happens. It happens with vintage, especially in some of like the weird cusp eras where it's like, it could have been 50s, could have been 60s. I don't know. But I think when it comes to that, I think a lot of sellers do fear being wrong. But I think when it comes to that, if the seller's just very clear about, hey, I don't know, I think that's okay.
I think I don't know yet is a power sentence for an entrepreneur.
I think so too. I think a lot of people are very concerned with being right, and there's that fear of being wrong. And for me, it's just like, I'd rather say, I don't know if I'm right, but I'm going to try to find out as best I can. I'm going to try to learn. I'm going to try to figure it out versus like not putting it out there because I'm afraid of being wrong. That makes sense.
It does. It does. Now that we're taking some stances, we're going to hit the halfway mark with question 4, which is always a fun one. What's a hill you would die on? It can be as serious as you want or as silly as you want, your choice. But this is the first time I get to ask a vintage fashion expert and CEO what hill they'd die on. And I'm not passing that opportunity up.
There are 2 major camps when it comes to vintage. One of them is you own it, you can do whatever you want with it. And the other one is preserve it as best you can for future generations. How to preserve it as best you can.
Ooh, took a side.
That would make some people upset. But for me, it's like eventually that piece is going to get worn down enough that it's going to have to be altered to survive anyway. Like, it's a piece of history. They aren't making 1950s dresses anymore, right? Like, that 1950s dress should stay, and as it is. And by alterations, I'm not talking like a little bit of tailoring to make it fit your body more correctly, which I'm totally here for tailoring. But I'm talking like taking a 50s dress that's knee length and chopping it off to make it a mini dress to make it cute. That kind of stuff. You're like
squirming in your seat just even talking about it. Which I think is interesting. And I've learned that, yes, we're talking about the 50s, we're talking about the 60s, Edwardian, things like that. You have things in your warehouse from the 1700s. Like,
me too.
These are pieces that have been preserved for a real long time.
A really long time. And just things like, had that guy in the 1700s like chopped off his jacket to make it suit more modern times, we wouldn't have it anymore. And I think people forget that like future generations are going to want to see what existed before them, right? And there's a really interesting aspect of working with vintage. You get to touch and handle these things in a way that most people don't get to. There are so many things I've handled that you would only get to look at in a museum. You'd never get to look at the inside and see how it's made or feel it and feel the weight of it, the textile quality, any of that kind of stuff. So, we're really privileged to still have pieces out there that you can hold and touch and examine. And I think it's important that we keep those around as much as we can for future generations. And that becomes difficult with certain textiles. Things disintegrate over time. And with those, I think it's important to visually preserve them. A lot of what gets preserved in museums is the highest end of the highest end, with the provenance and the label and all that kind of stuff. The things that don't get preserved are like 1930s flower sack dresses. Those are really amazing. They should be getting preserved. But they don't get the love that the beautiful Hollywood 1930s evening gowns get. So I think for me, preserving especially the workwear or the everyday wear of the people is just as important as these higher end things. And I think through selling vintage, we really get a chance to do that.
I want to dig in a little deeper here because with our next question, because it sounds like a very, at times, intense role right? And I know you have a team, you're the CEO. Yes, of course, as an entrepreneur, as a startup founder, you do all the jobs, whatever needs to get done. But as you've grown, being able to bring on a team, and it's not only you digging through boxes, only you fulfilling orders. Like those days are moving past. So like the seriousness of running a business, right? It's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do in this market. It's not an easy thing to do when you don't pattern match to who typically gets funding. Given all of this and the seriousness of constantly learning, constantly being in touch with customers and the vintage community, how do you play? What does play look like in your life?
Oh, wow. So I haven't gotten to properly play in a very long time. And honestly, I'm going to say this, but if I did have the opportunity to just go play and have fun, I would be going out and sourcing vintage. So it's like, even though like I'm working and this is my job and I do it every day, when I get a chance to go out of town or go to a new place, I'm still, making those phone calls and checking those estate sales and seeing what's out there, seeing what vintage is like in this town. And as much as I've tried not to do that, I'm like, no, I need to take a complete break from work, no vintage, turn the phones off, turn the computers off. It really doesn't happen. It's something I enjoy doing. And even though I do it every single day,
it's part of who you are. It sounds like it's like you even speak about it with such joy, and the same kind of joy that comes from
every day
doing something you love.
Yeah. So playing for me is unpacking boxes. Playing for me is washing something that's absolutely filthy and seeing it get clean again. Handing something off to the lady that does our restoration and saying, okay, like, there's a football-sized hole in this skirt. How do we either relieve it or, keep it as original as possible while still preserving its wearable integrity? And then seeing that piece like go out into the world as a wearable garment, when it wasn't before. I think those things for me are what get me excited. So, if it's not going to be rescuing clothes, then maybe I'd be rescuing dogs or something, because
you can't help helping. You can't help yourself from helping.
It's crazy.
Your purpose is so ingrained in who. Well, you chose a great career in business for yourself. Then,
thankfully, because I do. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are days where I'm just fried and I just want to like go do nothing. But I will still catch myself like looking at what other people might have and look at that cool thing. And it's like sometimes I'm like, no, put the phone down. It's okay. It's not, vintage today. But it happens every day, no matter what.
So what would you say is the hardest part of your job? And what's the best part of it?
The hardest part of my job is that a lot of people don't take vintage seriously as an industry. And I'm sure any vintage sellers out there are going to relate to this. When your parents is like, when are you going to get a real job? It is a real job. The industry needs to be taken more seriously. It's a $42 billion market segment. It's huge. And there are a lot of people out there that love this stuff, just like I do. And it needs to be taken seriously as an industry. And then what was the other question?
It's what's your favorite part of the job, but I want to ask a follow-up question on the hard part.
Favorite part of the job.
So wait, before you answer that, I want to ask a follow-up question to the hardest part. Because and I'm asking because out of genuine curiosity, because it sounds like you're living in the vintage world, right? You're talking to sellers, you're talking to customers. So who is it hard to convince that vintage is serious and that it's a big industry? Because it doesn't sound like it's sellers and customers. So who do you need to convince? And that's the hard part of the job.
Yeah. So first it was parents, of course. When I very first started, it was parents. I know some of the people that work with me have the exact same problem. Their parents want them to get out of the vintage industry and find a real job.
Y'all are grown-ups. It's not like y'all are 17 still living at home. Ooh.
And then, being in the startup world, And talking to people in the startup industry, that whole, it's a completely different universe than the vintage world. They're focused on the future. Vintage is focused on looking at the past and bringing it, into the contemporary world. And startup stuff is constantly focused on, like, what are your numbers and what's the future? And when you mention that you work with old clothes, the reaction is just like, who wants old clothes? Because it's just not a part of their world. And it can get really exhausting. It's like saying, who's into antiques? No one asks that. Everyone knows there are a lot of people into antiques, right? Who's into history? It's a degree. A lot of people are interested in it. But for some reason, clothes, like that aspect of fashion, really takes a backseat. And I know some of the argument out there, some of the discussion around why this might not be taken seriously, it's traditionally women's work. Fashion is, some of the major fashion designers are men, but when it comes to the work behind the scenes, the sewing and the construction and who's being marketed to, a lot of that has to do with women. And unfortunately, in our society, a lot of things that women love aren't taken seriously. They're seen as frivolous. And I think vintage fashion, between the history and the majority of sellers and buyers being women, it can really take a backseat.
Thank you for pointing that out. As you were talking, I was like, this sounds like some gendered BS. And I'm glad you named it.
When I say that, like, the majority of buyers are women, an interesting aspect of that is that the majority of the clothing that remains is from women. So men tend to buy vintage fashion on kind of the same scale as women, except there's just not as much of it out there, because traditionally men only needed a few suits and like a couple of leisure pieces, and they just wear things to death, whereas women had to be seen on a different dress at every event. And so there's a lot of vintage women's wear left over, but the men's wear, a lot of it has just been worn to death.
Fascinating. There's typically a different 8th question, but it's my show, so I can change the rules on the fly if I want, and that's what we're going to do. Because you live at this intersection of vintage fashion, where it's looking at the past and bringing it into the contemporary, to use your words, and startup tech world, where it's using technology to build something that doesn't exist yet, to solve a problem in a new way that's never been done before, where do you think the opportunity for vintage fashion to shift as an industry is? Like, why blend those two worlds? If there's, happy little sellers somewhere, customers are finding what they want, and the quote unquote tech world doesn't get the opportunity. Why are you pushing the boulder up the hill? Because it must be hard. And obviously you love vintage, but there's lots of ways to love vintage that isn't this. So what's this big opportunity you see to take this into the future?
Sure. So as someone who sells one-of-a-kind items, right? If I'm doing it by myself, it's really hard to get seen. But if I join together with tens of thousands of other people selling one-of-a-kind items that are similar to mine, that are talking to the same customer that I am, and all of a sudden it gets a lot easier. So our industry has been very fragmented. Lots of different marketplaces. None of them work for our community. Customers don't know where to go to find what they're looking for. There are a lot of sellers out there that are not educated in vintage, and so they're falsely misrepresenting goods, and not necessarily on purpose, just because they don't know any better. And it's really difficult to learn. So for me, the opportunity is bringing everyone together. So someone we both now said it best, the problem is the opportunity. And the problem of everything being fragmented, and that opportunity to bring it together into one hub, I think is really the opportunity in our industry, because when we're together, we're a lot stronger. The customer has one place to go. The seller has one place to go. And it really brings both sides, to a single point, which increases the entire industry's success.
I'm sure people have lots of different opinions about how you go about and do that, right? With their own experiences and their own perspectives. how do you know what advice to take and what to graciously say thank you and leave at the table?
I'm a very decisive person. I can make decisions very quickly. And when I get new information, it's kind of like an automatic yay or nay inside my brain. And when I get a piece of advice that isn't either one, that's something I know to explore deeper. So getting a lot of advice from people in the startup world that don't understand vintage, a lot of it will come through and will be an immediate yay or nay. And then some things will come through that really make you think like, oh, I hadn't looked at it from that direction before. It's a completely new perspective. And those are the things I think I really enjoy exploring. So kind of sifting out that false information, you can immediately feel if it applies to what you're building or not. And if it doesn't immediately apply, it's easy to just kind of like, okay, that was great advice, thank you, and move on. And if it does apply, if you're an entrepreneur, you've probably already thought of it or thought of something close. And then if it makes you go, oh, I've never thought about that before. That's really interesting. That's when I know to, really dig in.
I love that. That has my wheels turning on some things that some opinions and advice I've received recently. So I'll be putting that to practice. Now, for those people who have yet to explore or are now thinking, I never thought about that in regards to vintage fashion, where can they find you? How can they dive in? Where is the best way to get started with Fashion Conservatory?
FashionConservatory.com. The best place to get started is browsing, honestly. Look at the things, see what appeals to you, see what might work with your sense of style, know your measurements, that's very important. And start exploring with something, maybe a piece of jewelry, maybe a handbag, something that you don't necessarily have to, dress your whole body in. Just get a feel for it. See if it's something that you like.
Vintage rock t-shirt?
Yeah, exactly. Something that's low-key and will just kind of blend in with your contemporary wardrobe. And then some people think like if you're going to start wearing vintage, you have to wear everything vintage. And that's really not the case. Personally, myself, I like to mix vintage with contemporary. I think that suits my personal style best. And I think it's okay. Some people want you to go all vintage. People are going to have opinions. Let them have their opinions. That's cool. And do what you're comfortable with. Do what makes you feel good. And that can be something as small as a pair of earrings or a brooch. That can be socks. It can be a vintage rock t-shirt, whatever you find fits your personal sense of style.
Awesome. And for those who are the history buffs, tell folks how they can dig into vintage history on fashionconservatory.com because you have a historic treasure trove. Tell us about that.
So we have the largest archive of fashion labels online. So if you're interested in learning about specific labels or designers, brands that are out there, you can definitely dig into that. There's so much. It's just like a treasure trove of labels and images. I think we're at 4,000. We keep adding more every day. So I haven't necessarily thought of an exact date. I think we're about 4,000 labels online and over 80,000 garment images. And then if you're just interested in reading stories about fashion, we have a great blog. Our archivist really likes to explore little known dressmakers from the 1800s that were just kind of working in their own small towns. There's some really great stories about those. There's also some great, weirdly vintage fashion and true crime blog posts written that Patty has done that are just absolutely fantastic.
I will say I did the other day end up in a rabbit hole around the Titanic and some dressmakers and how it's linked to that tragedy. That was a fascinating story that I never knew I needed to know. So if you really like falling down quick and easy to process rabbit holes of history and ephemera and style and fashion, you will be happy. I can attest personally.
Next time you're here, you should absolutely talk to Patty about that because there's so much more that isn't even included in the blog. I think she's going to do another post about it. It has to do with the first wedding ever filmed and wedding show the Titanic instead of sinking and somebody owning it, so then throwing it away, and it's wild. There's some good stuff in there. And Patty's a great writer. She has so much fun with it.
Yeah. Well, and thinking about, that preservation angle of it and the hill you will die on, each of those garments, even what we're wearing today, carries a story. And so if we're talking about something from decades and or centuries ago, think about all the stories that shirt, that dress, that skirt, that jacket could tell. Even what we're wearing today, if it's brand new and you're the first person to wear it, you're not the first person that's touched that garment's history, both from the idea, the design, the manufacturing, the shipping. Like it's all part of one much.
And then if you take care of it, you won't be the
and
last person to touch it either.
Yeah, it's a much bigger fabric than one of us. Thank you so much, Mel, for joining us. FashionConservatory.com for everybody who is interested in learning more. There's also a contact and social media links on there so that you can follow along, see and learn about some beautiful things and get involved yourself. Mel, thank you again. This has been a delight.